My name is Simon Morioka. I'm the Joint Managing Director and co-founder of an organisation called PPL, which was part of the original People-Powered Health programme, working in partnership with Nesta, the Innovation Unit, and 6 sites nationwide, which were all looking at co-production in long-term conditions, so getting people more involved in their health and well-being. It's an absolute privilege today to be on stage with members of one of those 6 sites, Lambeth. Before we go any further on, I'm just going to ask each of my fellow panellists today just to briefly introduce themselves. Dennis.
Thanks. Hello, I'm Denis O'Rourke. I'm a local commissioner. I work for Lambeth CCG and Lambeth Council in an integrated commissioning team.
Hello, my name's Michaela. I'm a mum to, my son George was in hospital long term, 7 years under Section 3, and I never thought he'd come out, and he's now living in the community, doing really well.
Hello, I'm Adrian McLachlan. I'm a GP in Lambeth for approaching 30 years, I think, and chair of Lambeth Clinical Commissioning Group.
Hi everybody, I'm Aisling Duffy. I'm Chief Executive of a charity called Certitude, and I also have the privilege to chair the Alliance Leadership Team, which is part of the Mental Health Alliance in Lambeth.
Hello, I'm Soumitra Burman Roy. I'm the consultant psychiatrist working in the Lambeth Living Well Network Hub.
Thank you. So we're each going to talk very briefly about our experiences of Lambeth, and then try and open it up to the floor, to questions and answers and comments. The conversation will be a little bit about the journey in Lambeth, a little bit about where you guys have got to, and hopefully a little bit about the future as well. I was asked just to say a few quick remarks at the start about my experiences of Lambeth, and I was reflecting on this, and they really are from 3 different standpoints. So my mother's family are from Lambeth. So my original experiences of Lambeth were as a son and as a grandson of a family who, over many decades, going back to the war, had direct experience of health and social care services in Lambeth, including both mental and physical health services. A family that was genuinely appreciative of all of the support that they received from the statutory services, but often saddened by some of the experience and some of the outcomes of that support. And it wasn't then coincidental that when I went into the public sector, that one of my first jobs in the public sector was working in Lambeth. Claire and I, who co-founded PPL, did that based on the experience of working together at Lambeth Council, seeing some of the enthusiasm for change, feeling some of the frustration about the lack of change, and also understanding some of the barriers to that change, including the fact that the barriers to working together with people were often as high, if not higher, within organisations as they were between organisations. And whilst there were many conversations going on at that time between the council, the PCT as it was, the voluntary community sector, very few of those conversations actually involved the individuals and families who were intended to be the beneficiaries. And then I was very lucky enough later to be part of the People-Powered Health team. And at that time, the work that we were doing was working with the sites to try and articulate not just why working with individuals and communities in different ways was the morally right thing to do, but also why that represented one of the few potential ways that we were going to create high-quality, sustainable health and care services. And I think that 5 years on from that experience, what we would say is that the case has been made. There is more than sufficient evidence, and we've heard some of that this morning, that these approaches work. So the question now is not whether we should be doing this, but why we're not doing it more. And I think in that context, it'd be very interesting to get your view, Dennis, on where you started. So I know that Halima alluded this morning to the end of patients and the end of patients, and also a little bit about the journey of the last 5 years.
Okay, thank you. I suppose it's rolling back to around 2010, beginning January, February 2010. We began a conversation in Lambeth amongst a range of partners, so as commissioners, as third sector, primary care clinicians. This is in the days prior to CCGs. Psychiatrists within the Secondary Care Trust, but particularly with people who use services and carers. And that conversation sprung out of a dissatisfaction of, one, the return, as it were, on the very large-scale investment we were putting in as a local authority and as an NHS into adult mental health services. So very poor health outcomes, both physical and mental health, but actually more so recognition that unless we address people's housing situation, issues around work, around income, around connection, we heard a lot this morning around isolation, that we're actually, we weren't going to get to the heart of what really mattered to people. And I think at the time also our partnership board, we're at the back end of the old mental health national service framework, which I'm sure many of you will remember, in that, tail end of the 80s into the noughties. So lots of positive investment in the services, but a conversation that was very much dominated by clinicians, the medical profession, often at the expense of excluding people who use services, often a very adversarial relationship with user groups that existed, and for that matter, families and carers. But also the third sector, as we'll come on to. The third sector very much squeezed out of the conversation. So we thought we needed to change that. And so we began a conversation about, well, what would good look like? And with some external support, we worked with Nesta, New Economics Foundation, Innovation Unit, a number of other people in the room. See Linda from LH Alliances. Don't be shy, grab as much help as you can, was our motto in the early days. And I think one of our mantras was, we don't know all the answers, but together we're more likely to get there. And that's as true today as it was 6-7 years ago. So we did a lot of work around vision, and vision around reframing the relationship that services had with people who use services. So trying to move away from a relationship that was focused on diagnosis and regarding people as patients, recipients, but one which actually framed the relationship around people as citizens in their own right. And what followed from that then was a work around trying to define what the good outcomes look like. And again, moving away from a focus purely on clinical outcomes to one which focused on people's broader autonomy, supporting people to have choice and control through maybe access to education, through work, better housing, but also connecting people with community. Often many people that we work with have lost contact with family, with friends, etc., etc. So they were as important as the clinical interventions. We formed a collaborative platform to take forward this conversation. We're still meeting 6-7 years on at 8 o'clock in the morning in a social enterprise cafe down in Clapham, purposeful, a more neutral venue, which could hopefully allow a more level playing field between all those who have got a contribution to make. We did a lot of stuff together. So we varied contracts with the third sector to develop support planning. We became a personal health budget site. We worked with the Mental Health Trust to put more resource into primary care, supported the development of peer support, which has been a real game changer, not gone far enough. Alongside that, as commissioners, we also considered, how we were behaving and how we were supporting change, and recognised that our traditional contracting approaches weren't conducive to supporting good holistic outcomes. Furthermore, competition wasn't helping actually the whole system to come together and integrate around a common set of outcomes. So that's where we became interested in alliancing, whose roots are in the engineering oil industries. But where those industries, inherently competitive, realised actually collaboration, cooperation between all parts of the system, the supply chain, was far more effective in delivering better outcomes, better products, better infrastructure. So we asked ourselves, well, why the hell in the care world, where we're also apparently aligned on a common set of outcomes and common objectives, why can't we do that? So we've put a lot of effort into then trying to formulate more integrated ways of working, bringing the third sector, primary care, social care, secondary care, working in a much more integrated way. Initially through our Living Well network, which others will talk about. But since April 2015, we entered into a full commercial alliance agreement, which was focused on some of the most challenging individuals, in quotes, people within our system. Around 200 people who were placed in bed-based provision. Roughly around 200 people costing around £12 million a year. Very limited, if not poor outcomes. And we set about then working with the third sector, our local mental health trusts, South London and the Maudsley, and 2 local voluntary organisations, Certitude and Thames Reach, Aisling from Certitude today. And again, out of that, we have together, collaboratively, delivered some really positive impacts on people's lives. And Michaela's going to say a little bit about her experience and her son, etc. On the back of all of this, we're now moving towards applying the learning of the last 5-6 years and moving towards a whole system approach to alliancing, basically placing the totality of our local government and NHS adult mental health spend into a single alliance agreement with providers from across the whole system aligned on a common set of outcomes. It's probably enough for me. That's 6 years in 5.
Thanks, Dennis. I mean, that seems to be a very good point, Michaela, to bring you in. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing with us something of your story and what the changes that Dennis has described meant for you and for your son.
I was saying earlier that I never realised the enormity of what's happened to my son until I went to the Certitude awards ceremony last year, and there was a video, and I only watched it the other day, and George's psychiatrist was saying it's one of her biggest achievements, that my son's out of hospital. And the other day I thought, oh my God, it is a miracle that he's out. And I'll just tell you, it started off when he was in his late teens. He was going out raving, going to drum and bass raves, and then he got ill. Didn't really know what was wrong with him, but he started getting arrested for silly things, and he got put in prison. And while he was in prison, they realised that he was really not well, and they sectioned him to Lambeth Hospital, to the intensive care ward. It's so long ago now that I forget the details of it all. It was in a really, really intense, I think it was one of the highest security wards, and you couldn't even get any sense out of him. And then I've seen him over the years. He got progressively more violent towards patients and staff, and he's been on every single medication. I'd go up there, he'd be dribbling, he couldn't eat, couldn't swallow. I think, I can't even remember how long, maybe 3 years ago, he was so violent and they put him on a forensic ward because they said, although he's ill, he cannot keep attacking staff, and he's attacked his solicitor. It's just, the stories that these things that have happened, it's just horrific. And then I think it's year before last, I think it was Christmas time, he said, sometimes I wouldn't even go to visit him because I couldn't handle the stress of the visits, because it would be, I'd go up there and he'd be unwashed and like nails long, just really awful, but I just accepted, it was like grieving for him, I just accepted that he's never coming out. And then I think it was Christmas, do you know what, it's so much has gone on over the years, I can't get my time. He said, I went up to visit him. Now, this is a kid that wasn't even allowed out on leave. He had to be escorted to have a cigarette and stuff like that. And he said, Mum, I'm getting my own place soon. And I said, no, you're not. No, you're not, son. It's like, you've been in here 7 years, you're not. And he said, no, I am. And I just went home and I said, oh, George said he's getting his own place. And then it all started coming into motion. She said, yeah, I'm going into the place in Streatham. And then we went to visit, and I thought, oh, this is actually happening. what I never thought would happen is happening. And then he was in the turrets, which is Certitude, and then we could go and visit. They had the kitchen, he cooked us dinner. He still wasn't washing, he still wasn't dressing, still wasn't doing anything, sleeping all day. And then gradually, they was encouraging him to do his washing and have a wash and get up and do things. And as a mum, I used to want to go down there and do that for him, but they said, no, he's got to learn to do it himself. And then he'd go to Raw Sounds, which is a rapping, he likes rapping. And then he joined the football team. I was thinking, do you know what? You couldn't have dreamt it, do you know what I mean, what he's been through. And then he's moved on now to, he's sharing a flat, just him and a fella, Mark, that he used to live at the turrets with. They're complete opposites, but it works. And they're living together, they're sharing a flat. George is, I've got high-class problems now that I never thought I'd have. I'm worried about his choice of girlfriend now. And like he's telling me, Mum, I've got rid of that one because I like a curvier woman and all this. And I'm thinking, I'm worrying about his choice of girlfriends. And then a few weeks ago, he'd spent all his money. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I went to a poker night. And I thought, do you know what? I can't even moan at him because this time a couple of years ago, I'd never dreamt I'd have these worries. And it's, I feel stressed out now that I'm dealing with this stuff. When he was in hospital, I could quite easily think, oh, that's it. I haven't got to worry about him no more, which is quite selfish. I mean, now I'm thinking, what's he up to? What's he doing? But he turns up for he's got a gardening job, voluntary, and he's hoping to get a proper job with them. So he turns up to work. He's got a better social life than me. He's out all the time. But I do worry of him in the community. I think, do you know, I've got this worry that, yeah, I'll always worry about him because he's never going to be, I shouldn't say normal. He's always going to have his little things. Yeah, he can do things in public that you think, oh, stop it, George. But I think I'm privileged that I've got the opportunity to. We went out for a meal in Brixton a couple of weeks ago, and I thought this is amazing. I'm in Brixton Pop, in the middle of Brixton with my son, where every week I'd be visiting him in hospital for 7 years, walking up the road, and yeah, this changed everyone's life. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Adrian, from both Denis and Michaela, what we've heard is an enormous turnaround in both the way in which the system operates and the outcomes for individuals who are being helped by that system. And from your perspective as both a GP and as chair of the local commissioning group, could you just say a bit about kind of where people in the audience who are listening who are probably somewhere on this journey, where you start with delivering that kind of whole system change?
Simple thing is, it's hard to follow a story like that actually describes the reality of what's going on. But that, I think, is an important part of what has driven it, is the stories that we have, the stories that we can tell. And if people look on the Collaborative website, you'll see other stories like that, which is an important bit. I guess the other thing to say, it's been quite a personal thing in that, you know, the things I've been doing in the CCG, you know, this bit sticks more than any other bit, not just because I'm on the stage here saying that today. And I think in the introduction I missed out the fact that I feel I'm a member of the Collaborative, and that's something, it's on my register of interest, I'm a member of the Collaborative, and it does feel something special like that. And that step felt like a very important thing, and we've done lots of things locally in integrated care, different things we've integrated, and have often focused on integrating services or bringing together organisations, things like that. The thing that has often felt was done latest and should have been done earliest in many of the things has been the kind of cultural integration and what builds trust and builds understanding between people working together. And that's something that I think we have done, and as Denis has said, the fact we've been having breakfast together for 7 years now has led to a whole level of understanding, I think, and trust that makes a difference. And I'll give a couple of examples. So as a GP and as a clinical commissioner, you know, the whole reforms, and obviously the world's changed hugely in the 7 years we've been doing this. I think that, you sometimes lose track of how different it is. We didn't have CCGs back then. We didn't have austerity or anything like we have now. So we've seen come through a lot of things. But one example in the early days, one of the things we did was set about a system of prototyping and saying, okay, what might we do? Let's try out some things. Let's do small tests of a different way of offering a service. And those of us around the table at breakfast were asked, do we know anyone who might be up for doing that? And someone who's registered in my practice was one of the first people to go through a kind of a new offer. It was a short-term thing. It was a test, but that test led to, bit by bit, what we are doing now. And that felt like an important thing to be a part of. And then actually only yesterday, doing surgery, someone came to me for a routine review, seen about every 6 months. Someone with long-term and quite significant problems, who's now working as a peer, and is actually part of the offer that we have locally. And so much of the conversation wasn't about me checking his blood pressure or asking what he thought of his medication, but actually how things were going. Things were a bit quiet at the moment. He didn't have anyone to work with just now, so it was feeling a bit quiet, and he was looking to get back working again and having someone else that he could be supporting. And that again seems like quite a different thing to be experiencing. I guess bringing it back to kind of the connection from those bits that I will get as the stories directly or in the practice, how that can then influence getting it right in the decisions we do and the struggles we have to try and make a difference. Because I think the other thing not to forget, this has been a long, at times quite painfully tough thing to make the changes that we've been looking to do. That's not been easy. And that sense of doing things together and having a kind of safe place to come back together where we can work things out around breakfast much of the time has been a central part to that journey. So that feels like the starting point, and get people together, eat together is a really good thing. Build that trust and do that kind of collaborative work, and that's the bit that sticks with me.
And Ashton, if I could just ask you to build on that. So Lambeth's always had a very diverse and vibrant voluntary and community sector, but the relationships haven't always been easy, not least with the statutory bodies. So what do you think it's taken to get people behind this as an initiative?
Thank you. I think as a third sector leader, the opportunity that I had and we had in Lambeth to really be part of something that really aligned with the kind of values and vision that we had in the voluntary sector, with actually a real opportunity to influence the wider collaboration, so our CCG partners, our secondary care partners, our local authority partners. So actually what it, I think, takes is grabbing the opportunity and stepping up as third sector providers to recognise that actually we have something very particular that we have developed alongside often people using services and families, and actually looking to be part of the wider offer that enables us to then deliver on the outcomes that Denis spoke about earlier. So I think we created in Lambeth a kind of good enough group of people, which we often talked about. We didn't think we were had all the answers. We didn't think that there was one part of the system where all the problems sat. I think there was a real energy put behind identifying what was our common ground. What were the things that we all agreed with, and what was the opportunity that we wanted to grab hold of to really change what was the experience of people using services, which was, poor outcomes. People weren't describing to us an experience that actually was one that any of us would have been proud to be part of. So we all had a part to play in actually creating a better set of outcomes. So actually building on the collaborative breakfast, we actually built trust, I think, or began to develop a new set of relationships with a much broader range of people than we had had in the past, and start to rewrite the narrative that had been the one that you described, Simon, that was a looking back narrative in Lambeth, and really think, actually, what's our opportunity here? And I think key to that is the kind of, I suppose, the leadership and really inviting, I suppose, voluntary sector, third sector partners to really step up to the opportunity to actually be part of leading change and not wait to be kind of invited. And often I think we can fall into that statutory third sector split and think we have to wait for some kind of invitation. And actually the invitation was there because actually things weren't working as well as they could and we had something to offer. It's hard work collaboration, as everybody in the room will know. And I think one of the biggest investments that you can make is time and is an appreciation of where other partners are coming from. So early on in our alliance, in the more formal alliance that Denis mentioned, the leaders of the organisations involved in that, in South London Maudsley Foundation Trust, in Certitude, in Thamesreach, in the local authority and in primary care, we actually spent time together in a minibus. So we do breakfast and we do minibuses in Lambeth. And we went on a tour of Lambeth and we took the opportunity to introduce each other to the services we actually provide. And actually began to open up conversations with each other about what were the differences and what was the common ground in what we were providing and what was the opportunity to build much greater sense of integration and integration around people who are using our services rather than around our organisations. And what that began was a kind of series of opportunities to improve the understanding of each other's challenges and barriers facing each of our providers in enabling big change to happen. And those relationships and that trust began to be developed further and further. And we now have an alliance that is really thriving. There's still huge challenges in terms of making real change happen, but we're in a much stronger place in terms of the trust between the different parts of our system. And I think that's what you need to create the conditions that allow great things to happen and great things to thrive.
Thank you. And Soumitra, I think a fairly consistent theme through this morning has been the importance of clinicians and the role of professionals in all of this and making it happen. I wonder if you could just describe for us a bit about how this has impacted on your professional practice.
So, I mean, I've been in the hub in the Living Well Network hub for about 6 months now. So I'm relatively new in it, and I can feel that my practice is changing as I'm there. It's obviously very ongoing. But previously I've worked in sort of inpatient and community mental health services, traditional services. And I think when I first started here, I thought, actually, what's that different? You know, we're sort of trying to take a very person-centred approach. Well, that's something that I've been taught to think about a lot over the last 5 years. But I think after spending a bit of time in the service, I do think that things are very, very different. And I think it's largely about this sort of assets-based approach and thinking about accessing resources that are not your traditional statutory resources. And so we may have been thinking about similar things, sort of helping people with vocation, with housing, etc. But I don't think that I would have ever have thought of looking out into the community as much as we do now, and we do within the hub. And I think sort of sitting together with people who work in all these different services means that you're just exposed to different things. And so you're constantly learning about other services that are out there. There's, you know, we email round within all the staff constantly, oh, we found something new, there's this great new service we've heard about. That hasn't happened in any other team I've worked in before. So it's constantly people are sort of building up their list, building up threads that we send through to other people of this is the information around sort of, you know, whatever activity it may be that people are interested in. So I think there's a lot of that's going on constantly, and I can feel my practice changing with that. But I think there's also a big difference, it's quite a subtle difference in the culture within the people working within the service. Because I think, obviously, everybody who's particularly working within mental health, you're very well-meaning, you're wanting to help people through periods of difficulty. But I think, even if you are patient-centred, there's a tendency to want to do something for people. You know, people are coming to you when they're going through a hard time, and sometimes people want you to do something for them. But there is a risk, I think it was mentioned earlier today, that when you're doing something for people, you're sort of doing it to them as well, and you're, without meaning to, you perhaps are disempowering them slightly. And I think there's a real focus on individual, and on an individual asset-based approach almost. Like, what are your assets? What are your strengths? From the first point of contact with the service, and then thinking about how we can relate that to other things that are going on in the community. And I suppose I was thinking before I came up here today about a case to illustrate that. And I recently saw a young lady who came to see me, I think just last week. And she's had very difficult experiences growing up. Lots of sort of trauma in her family, lots of moving around, moved to another country from the UK for 8 years of her life, was out of schooling, had a very difficult relationship with her mother, who was her only parent. And I think her mother, from her report, sounds like also had was suffering with a lot of mental health distress as well. So on the background of this, she learned that she struggled to manage her feelings and her emotions, and started to do things such as using drugs, drinking a lot, getting involved in other sorts of risky behaviours that were putting herself in danger. But over time, so she's sort of in her late 20s now, when she was about 18, 19, she returned to the UK on her own. She entered into formal education again, has been studying, and is now trying to she is doing a distance learning course in law. And she's stopped engaging in a lot of the behaviours that were harmful for her, or that she found were unhelpful, and has been trying to do other things. But she came to us to say, what's my diagnosis? I've read all this stuff on the internet. This is what I think I have. And in a sense, am I doomed? That, if this is if this is what I have, then is that the end point? This sort of trajectory of illness. And so I think that sort of individual assets-based approach is to say, but look what you've done. You've turned everything around yourself. That you've come to us now. The fact that you've come to us, having done all of this, sort of demonstrates how much resilience and strength you have. And yep, we can talk about diagnosis, but I think probably what's more useful is to think about what you're suffering with, what are your ongoing difficulties, what are the symptoms, in a sense, that you're struggling with, and what are your skills, and then to think about how we can help you with that, whether it's through medication or traditional psychotherapies, or whether it's through loads of other things that go on within Lambeth that we can signpost you to, or that we can recommend to you. And so we spent half of the session talking about sort of exercise classes that are out there, dance classes that she wants to get involved in, improv theatre, thinking about sort of mindfulness and different meditation groups that are out there. And to be honest, a lot of this stuff I don't know a huge amount about, but I feel very lucky that within this service we've got lots of peers who are working there who I really feel very comfortable saying to this new patient, please go and speak to this person who I trust and know within our service, who can recommend other things to you. So that's a long way of saying I think it has changed my practice in a lot of ways, probably quite subtle but quite significant.
That's fantastic, thank you. This feels like a good point to open this up. So I'm sure from what you've heard you must have a number of questions, maybe comments. There's a microphone that will be going around, and if you wouldn't just mind saying your name, your organisation, that would be great just at the start. So if we have one here to start with and one here.
Hi, Valerie Carr. I'm with Snook. I do service design. I also have a son with a serious mental health problem. Someone spoke earlier about the kind of having the bravery to disinvest in what's not working to enable us to invest in what is working. And some of the health boards that I've worked with have been very focused on crisis and crisis management, and say, well, we can't take the money out of the crisis end to invest in the preventative end because, people are going to die. So how did you actually make that shift to kind of investing more resource and money in the prevention?
Thank you. And if we just take a second question, just over here.
Dave DePaster from Kids, which is a disabled children, young persons charity. I'm interested in the change of behaviour for commissioning that was needed to make this work. I used to work in the oil and gas industry, so I know quite a lot about the alliancing approach. And I remember when that started, the biggest resistance came from procurement and auditors, because of it required a very different way of measuring outcomes and of performance management. So I'm interested in how this is going to, how the actual commissioning process had to adapt and change. Most of the services that kids provide go through commissioners, and it's hard sometimes to feel that you're really able to get to the end needs of the people that you're trying to help through the actual commissioning process.
Great, thank you. So, Adrian, if I could come to you first, just on that question about commissioning and decommissioning. So, we talk about investing in new services, but we also know that there's no new money and pressures on existing services are rising. How has the CCG balanced that?
And one sort of flip comment to make, when CCGs were first set up, I think various people suggested that actually they might be better named clinical decommissioning groups. And I think you're right that that's something that we just are often too frightened of and don't do enough of stopping doing things that are not working well. And one of the things I would look for in a sort of in a certainly mixed crowd is who are the people who might help us with that, because I think the political barriers and the resistance to change and stopping things is a tough one to face. We have been, I think, in some ways fortunate in Lambeth, having Guys and Thomas's charity, which I think has enabled us to do elements of dual running, so that when we're doing something new, we're not immediately having to find the money by stopping something old. So that gives us, I think, a safety net to innovate, but at some point, the real world returns and something has to close and change. And I think we have actually a very good example. Denis talked about the alliance contract we have for the 200 people. Actually, as doing that, we've closed a ward, and that has happened without protests from the large provider, without political protests from MPs, councillors, or public outrage that we've shut something, because that felt like the right thing to do. We had a much better offer. And I guess the other bit is the fact that we have this close integration between CCG and the council, so bringing together health commissioning and social care commissioning in one place, which has made things hugely easier.
Denis, do you want to say a little bit more about that and also about the experience of procurement?
Yeah, I mean, Ashley might want to come in all this on the IPSA, the alliance, and this issue of decommissioning. I think key to that was one, a degree of transparency about what was working, and a sort of whole system recognition, actually, that placing people in very expensive inpatient rehabilitation beds, or for that matter, in residential care settings, was almost tantamount to warehousing people. Actually, the outcomes that those individuals experienced were extremely limited, and little evidence that people were really progressing to independence, if not actually the opposite. Many people were vegetating, and I think key to enabling that change to happen was having clinicians rubbing shoulders, partly along the lines that Soumitra was describing, rubbing shoulders with voluntary sector workers. 10 years ago, the amateurs in the voluntary sector. Well, actually, what the voluntary sector had rammed home is that actually, if you start having a conversation and really listening to people, and taking on board their strengths and assets, you end up in a very different place to one an approach which is fixated on an individual's diagnosis. I mean, Ashley, do you want to add?
I would. Thank you, Denis. Yeah, I mean, we had an absolute premise that actually we could deliver better outcomes for people by doing things very differently. And then actually, and some of that difference was by bringing people together, community connectors, peer supporters, clinicians, occupational therapists, a variety of skills together to actually look at how we would create a better offer for people. And so that premise was what we had to build some momentum behind, because actually that premise was also going to reduce cost and actually change the whole way that people kind of received support. So the development of the Living Well network, but also within IPSA, the closure of the ward that Adrian talked about, and the development of much more community connected services, where actually I suppose some of the expectation around risk and how people's risk assessments were carried out and how people were supported to have a kind of different narrative. So George's narrative being very, very different to the one that had been what had retained him in hospital for 7 years. So kind of building some momentum behind that vision was probably one of the biggest challenges we had in the early months, certainly of the IPSA. There was certainly, I can still hear the kind of, where's the evidence base? Where's the evidence base? Well, where's the evidence base for what's working now? It's clearly not here. So actually we have to be brave. We have to try some of this new stuff. We have to bring people together. And I think, Denis's point about bringing different people together, bringing the voluntary sector clinicians and our wider sector together and helping people to realise that actually they've got some accountability to do things differently. And actually we'll back them and we'll support them to try things in a way that perhaps they hadn't the opportunity before. And that's for strong leadership, because actually believing that by doing things differently you can deliver better outcomes doesn't always have a science behind it. And that's I think that's our looking forward, which I'm sure we'll come on to. That's one of our biggest challenges as we go to the wider whole system alliance. So yes, that's what I wanted to say there. In terms of the procurement stuff, I mean, we have rocked up against or whatever procurement a number of times in terms of how our alliances worked. I think, and I'm not just saying this to be licky and on the stage with Adrian and Denis, but actually you need strong, visionary, committed commissioners who are going to drive change. And I spoke earlier about third sector stepping up. We need some of that to be helped by our commissioners, and that's exactly what happened in Lambeth. There was a real opportunity and a real challenge to try and think, well, how can we get on with some of what we need to achieve without potentially seeking, I suppose, going under the radar in some ways, actually trying to find ways to work together to achieve the outcomes that we are wanting. And that took us coming together and deciding that there was a real opportunity to prototype, to try things, to pilot things. And we as a group of organisations, so a couple of statutory and a couple of voluntary sector organisations, were I suppose willing to take the punt that we could work together under a fairly short contracting arrangement, because that would allow us to maybe not face some of the challenges around procurement, that would allow us to demonstrate some of the win and the changes that we could make. Okay. Do you want to say something more, Denis?
Just like to take a couple more questions from the floor and we'll come back, Denis. So one right the way over the back.
Shirley Ayres, Connected Care Network. Health and care commissioners so often seem to be the weakest link, and I hear that in so many different contexts. And I quite agree about the need for visionary, passionate leadership. Now, are there any courses available, any training that we can share for the majority of commissioners who still have to make that step forward in terms of vision and stepping up to meet the expectations of people receiving their services today?
It's an excellent question. We have one more question over here.
Hi, John Siddle, Director of Funding at Guy's and St Thomas Charity. So firstly, thank you very much for sharing your story today. My question is one of timing. So you've talked a lot about the 7 years it's taken to understand each other, build trust, build relationships. Looking back on those 7 years, is there any way we can speed that up, or does it just take time?
Okay. And I think we had another question just in the middle here. If we just take a third one here.
Yes, this is Nick Webb from Innovation Unit. As I understand it, in the last 5 years, a kind of key part of the development of innovations in Lambeth has been co-production and the voice of the service user being central to the redesign of services. And I just wondered, how are you going to kind of take that forward into the next phase of contracting and retain that that co-production and the kind of people-powered health element as a central part of the overall system.
Great. So 3 excellent questions. Should we start just on the health and social care commissioning? So, Denis, you are clearly an exceptional health and social care commissioner. Where did you get your training, and where can other people sign up?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of courses on commissioning. What I would say is the course that most commissioners need is a course in humility, and also a recognition that we don't know all the answers. Actually, it's working together, creating the us dynamic. Collaboration is the way that we achieve better commissioning. And yeah, I think it's about tapping into the rich assets in our provider system, within our communities, people who use services. And our role is to help facilitate and enable that come together. So I'm sure there's great commissioning courses out there, but just for someone else.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, reinforce that. Be prepared to learn from each other. So I don't think someone has to sell you a course. I think most of the impactful learning I've done has been, as I keep saying, breakfast time.
And certainly I know, Denis, when we were talking about this before the session today, there were 6 sites on the original People Powered Health programme. I know your relationships with those other sites in many places continue today. And there is something about that peer-to-peer support network that's really helping commissioners to make brave decisions, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the learning, I mean, we've spent quite a lot of time engaging with sites up and down in the country. We were over in Belfast not long ago, talking to colleagues over there, and I think it is learning. We're on a journey, and I mean, we're still in contact. For example, I met a colleague from Stockport. And again, I mean, I think often in London we're in a bit of a bubble. We think we know it all, don't we? And you know, we're the innovators. Well, actually, there's some brilliant stuff, as we heard today. I mean, the stuff in Salford around asset-based community development, etc. There's really some powerful stuff across the country. And I think that's probably one of the richest veins of help that we've got, you know, or received over the last few years.
And I think there was a question from John about the length of time that this has taken. And I'm sure that's a question that'll be on a lot of people's minds as well. And I do remember somebody saying once it's going to take 10 years, and people saying, well, that's too long. And then them saying, well, if we don't start today, it's going to take 10 years plus 1 day. So you've got to start somewhere. But any perspectives on whether it's possible to do this quicker?
Well, I think we do ask ourselves that question. We have neighbouring boroughs who look at what we're doing, and it would make a lot of sense. You know, there's not a kind of wall around Lambeth by any means, and you know, I don't think we are unique. And can they do it faster than we can? Following on that, I'm not sure how much faster, because I think those early bits do feel important, but I'm sure it can be accelerated. And as we move into a world of different scales and STP, geography, social sustainability and transformation, you know, can things happen faster by learning on those who've gone first and take things at a bigger geography? I would like to think so.
I think where the bottom-up approach that we've used in Lambeth, I think, has been critical to where we are now. And in other boroughs where Certitude works, where there's been an attempt to try and move at a greater pace, it's often using top-down approaches. And we don't achieve the same kind of co-production and genuine change and improvement in longer term sustainability of those outcomes. So I think it does take time, and relationships are critical to the success, and relationships take time to build, and that trust to really be embedded. So while there might be some of the piloting of things that we could have done more quickly, I'm not sure that you can force those relationships to happen quite at the pace that ideally we might want.
Michaela, I just want to ask you, so when I was listening to your story about your son, obviously it's a story that's taken place over a number of years, but the number of years don't really reflect the degree of progress that he's made in that time. And it sounds like he was very much part of that story. He wasn't simply turning up and receiving help in the new world and the new model. He was very much taking a lead in kind of pushing the boundaries of what his life could be.
Yeah. I just think it was a combination of the medication. In the end, they got the medication right. I think maturity. He was. I mean, he's 28. He went in there as a boy. He's come out a man. Just the support he got. I noticed the biggest change in him was when he went into Streatham. It was like he had a bit of dignity. He's like, it was like he was being treated like a human being again, like not just. I mean, I don't want to run the ward down, but if he didn't bath for a week and a half, they didn't care. There was no encouragement. They in Certitude, they slowly. I mean, it took a while, but they slowly encouraged him to sort of, start living. Just what we all take for granted. Do you know what I mean? So, I just think the support has been amazing. I didn't even know it existed. I thought if he ever did come out, he'd just come home with me, and it'd be just complete stress. I mean, I'm quite glad now that he's in supported housing, because I don't think I would probably. I think somebody said it earlier. You know, sometimes you're not helping by being helpful. If I was his mum and trying to do everything for him, it wouldn't help him. I mean, now I can go a couple of weeks without speaking to him, and I feel really guilty and think I haven't spoken to George, and I'll ring where he's living. I'll say, is George right? Yeah, he's fine. He's at work. He's went out last night. No, he's fine. And I think that's all I want to hear. Or I'd be running down there every day trying to take care of him, and I can't do that. He's a man. He's got his own life.
I know we've only just got a couple of minutes left, so what I'd just like to do is just go down the line and just get one or two sentences on where you would like to see this go next. So, Soumitra, would you mind kicking us off?
I think I'd like us to have a greater capacity to sort of reach out, or not even to reach out, but to know what else is going on within the borough, and really to be able to sort of draw upon other services, or just know what else is going on, if that makes sense, to find out the other assets. I think that's always a challenge.
I think we have a huge opportunity with the whole System Alliance that's been planned in Lambeth, and very hopeful to be part of. But with that, not lose the great learning that we have gained over the last couple of years, and make sure that our heart, that actually is driven by a co-production methodology, actually remains absolutely the driver for what's right for people and for service development in Lambeth.
And I would echo that. So we've spoken almost entirely about mental health here. This approach, what we've learned, the way we've done things, this has to be the answer for more than simply mental health. And so, across all the things that we commission, I would like to see the same approach happening, and a larger scale alliance or multiple alliances being part of that. But also that cultural change, which it still feels, we're a small group of people in the room here, we're a small group of people at breakfast, there are tens of thousands of people doing things in a different way, to try and see some change more widely.
Okay. What would you like to see for the future?
Who me? Just my son out of hospital. Never wanted. I mean, there might come a day where they've said that he could relapse, but it's just, it was a nightmare. And now I wake up, I haven't got that. I'm not grieving for my son anymore. I'm naturally worrying about him, but like a mother should do. I'm not grieving for him. He's not written off anymore. I love it.
And Dennis, would you like the last word?
Sort of two things. One, I think, and it partly speaks to a couple of the questions around the future possibilities and pace. We think digital thinking, particularly as it's applied to workforce, but also indeed how people can take control over their own life through lots of different devices, etc., has potential to really move on at a pace. But I think the other one is around communities and place. that actually a lot of what we've been talking about is trying to develop good practice around asset-based co-productive approaches, but what we haven't really tapped into is the power and the contribution of communities in a very local level. Many of us, we're developing local care networks up and down the country, but often at population levels of 50, 100,000, they're probably too big. We need to drill down to a much more local level, and I think through that, I think we've got some really enormous potential to tackle some of the challenges. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just to say, before we break, the refreshments and another networking opportunity now in the main area behind you. If you could be back in here for 3:30 for the next session. I'd just like to thank all of our panellists for their insights and to thank you for your attention and questions today. Thank you very much.